Well, I don't even know where to begin with the news today because everything's coming together now. The markets, the Wu flu, uh, and a perennial topic that I always like discussing, potential new wars in the Middle East. So yesterday, around the time that I was actually recording my video talking about North Korea, President Trump decided to go and tweet that he has advised the U.S. Navy to shoot down any and all Iranian gunboats, essentially that look at them the wrong way. And this was a response to Iran, I guess, having, Iran always has these little boats that go around the Persian Gulf, because of course it is, the Persian Gulf. It's right where Iran is. Their coastline is like half the Persian Gulf. And they have these boats that run around, and they'll kind of get up close to these big Navy ships, and they might pull down their eyelid at them and stick out their tongue, or smack themselves on the butt and be like, "Ooh, chase me," just tease people. And I guess Trump, doesn't like them being so disrespectful like that, and so next time, according to Trump, what the U.S. should do is, if these little Iranian boats want to come around U.S. ships, and they should just be blown out of the water. Now, ordinarily, this is not be a great thing to tweet necessarily for the economy, because any idea of a conflict between the U.S. and Iran would significantly threaten the world oil supply. And in fact, I was saying last year or earlier that these past few times since Trump has been president, that there have been moments where it looked like the U.S. could go to war with Iran. I said that I didn't think that was feasible at the time, because it would create such a major supply side shock in the oil markets, to where the price of energy would skyrocket, and that would slow down the global economy, bring it to a halt, and Trump wouldn't want that, because of course Trump's his main sort of selling point to people why he's a good president is that the economy is doing well, as far as he's concerned. But now, of course, the price of oil is not really such a big issue. Oil, just a couple days ago, was in negative territory, negative $40 a barrel. They were paying you to take away oil. That's how cheap oil was. And so if there were any time in which a war with Iran would become economically feasible, it would be right now. Because as I've been pointing out, oil is so cheap that it's bankrupting pretty much every American oil company. And America is the top producer of oil in the world. Mind you, we are not the top exporter, because we consume a good chunk of our oil. But nobody produces more than the U.S. But in the U.S., we have to produce oil at a much higher cost than in other parts of the world, because we're essentially trying to extract oil in the form of shale that's much more difficult to process, and that is not as simple as just drilling a hole in the ground like you're drilling a well for water. And so Trump, not only is he not penalized if he were to, say, start a war with Iran and invade that country, but not only would he not be penalized by oil becoming too expensive and hurting our economy because it's so cheap, it actually, could help him and politically, because it would save a lot of these oil companies in our country, because the oil companies employ a lot of people. There are a lot of towns that are entirely reliant on the oil industry. Even though America doesn't do a ton of, as far as percentage of our economy goes, a ton of manufacturing anymore. We don't process raw materials into goods. We do still produce a lot of basic, primary sector goods like oil and corn, agriculture and mining. That stuff still goes on in the United States. There's a lot of people who work in agriculture and mining and these primary sector, third world economy sorts of businesses. And so, right now, since the global demand for oil has collapsed as a result of the global shutdown of the economy, more on that later, the one thing that might possibly save all these North American oil companies, that will get the price of oil back to where they need it to be for them to be profitable, which I believe is somewhere between $30 and $40 a barrel for them to break even, most of these companies. And of course, some companies are going to be even higher than that. I think that a lot of these companies up in Canada, the folks who were pumping oil down through the Keystone XL pipeline that was such a big controversy a few years ago, I think they, for the way they do it, need oil to be somewhere in the 50s. But anyway, if the tap from the Middle East is just completely shut off because there's a war between the U.S. and Iran, and that paralyzes the Persian Gulf, because I did mention this earlier, I guess, in great detail, but most of your oil in the world is going to flow through the Persian Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz. Straits of Hormuz are, where the Persian Gulf empties out into the Indian Ocean, or maybe it's the Arabian Sea, one of the two. And so Iran always threatens to close the Straits of Hormuz, which, most people know is just a bluff. They couldn't actually do that. But in this case, considering we're under such, special circumstances, it might make sense for them to try and do that. And all of this would create massive chaos that would be a boon to any oil producer outside of the Middle East who doesn't have to worry about getting their crude through the Straits of Hormuz. And it's this action by the president, this specter of a possible, war with Iran once again, I think is what's behind this rally in the oil prices since yesterday, because the 2 days before, oil had crashed into negative territory. Now, I believe oil is up something like 50% off the lows. As of this recording, WTI is sitting around $17 to $18 a barrel, which is, of course, way up from being negative however much it was. But, oddly enough, it's still too cheap for any of these North American companies to make money. So if Trump wants to save the oil industry in North America, he's going to have to get the price of oil much higher. Actually, oil is getting so cheap, or was so cheap earlier this week. I think at this point it's not such a big problem for the Saudis, but I think that certainly if you've got oil in negative territory, even countries like Saudi Arabia, who are able to pump out their oil at a very low marginal cost, would still be impacted by this. They need to make some money in order to recoup the minimal cost that they have for pumping their oil. It does cost them something. They do need to make some money, and that's their entire economy's income is the oil, pretty much. And so Trump is incentivized not only for the sake of American oil companies, but even now for the sake of Saudi Aramco, the price of oil needs to go up. Now, on top of Iran, another potential target could be Venezuela, since they're also a big oil exporter. Though I don't know how much of an impact Venezuela's supply on their own impacts the global oil market, because it's certainly nowhere near the like shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. But perhaps a double attack on Iran and Venezuela at the same time, which would certainly, for the U.S. deep state, they'd be very happy to take out two birds with one stone, take down two of these petrostates that are, well, Iran's not really a petrostate, but two of these countries that are not favorable to Washington, and then also at the same time save the oil industry. The U.S., of course, as I've mentioned in the past, has issued a warrant for the arrest of Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela. They're basically calling him a drug dealer, same thing they did with Manuel Noriega, the CIA asset who was deposed by the U.S. military under George H.W. Bush. They could very easily do something similar here in Venezuela, send in the Marines to arrest Nicolas Maduro. Of course, I don't think any of this would be a good idea. I think that would be very disastrous for the U.S. in the medium to long term. But in the short term, I think that it could help out Trump politically. Now, this is why last year I was saying, I said that if there was any point in which Trump would invade either Venezuela or Iran, specifically I think I was talking about Iran at the time, it would be in the summer of 2020, because very early on we see with wars that it increases for a short period of time the president's popularity for the first couple months of the war, because people are feeling, people get riled up by the media. They're feeling this patriotic fervor, and they want to support their country, and so they approve of the president. And then inevitably things start to go bad, and people are like, I never supported this war to begin with, which of course is not true. This happened with Iraq, with Vietnam, with all sorts of things. And it probably would happen, with a war with Iran. People have been conditioned to hate Iran and Venezuela for many years. Of course, I'm not a fan of those countries either, but it doesn't mean that I want my government going and overthrowing them. I don't think that's a great idea. But if Trump did do that, he might be able to get a short-term boost. Now, that when I said that originally, that was assuming that there wasn't a global pandemic going on at that time. And if you add in that factor of the pandemic and everything that's going on, I think that Trump could seem out of touch if he pivots to foreign policy at a time when the domestic well-being of Americans is under such strain. I think that it would be perceived as too blatant of a distraction from the woes of Americans at home to try and pivot to conducting these two overseas wars. And so I think in all likelihood that if this were to happen, that the backlash against Trump might be immediate. Although the media has been very critical of his response to this whole virus thing, the only times in the past in which the media has really spoken favorably of Trump is when he's been very aggressive on foreign policy, and when he does things to Iran and Venezuela, and specifically Syria. The day when he ordered a bunch of missiles to be fired into Syria, the people on the mainstream media were saying, today's the day that Trump became president. Oh, he's so presidential. Look at this. He bombed a Middle Eastern country. I mean, now he's a real American president. And they said these things unironically. It's hard to believe, but there are psychopaths in media who do think that way. And so maybe Trump could actually get a bit of a reprieve from the media's derision were he to do that. But frankly, I wouldn't hold out too much hope for that. And so with everything that's going on, I think that there's a lot working in favor of a U.S. invasion of Iran, Venezuela, or both at this time. However, I think that the one thing that I pointed out, the domestic trouble is so severe that I really hesitate to say that on net all of these factors, such as the price of oil and the proximity to the election, which are working in favor of a war from a political calculation standpoint, I feel like are outweighed by the severity of this pandemic at home. Now, the one caveat to that is if Trump can somehow shift the narrative, if we can start moving towards reopening, if he can create this sense that we're back on the ascendance, that we've rounded the bend, that the pandemic is coming to an end, then if he can get that spirit engendered in the country, well, then on the way up, I think it would be very easy to sell a war, because it would be a part of this narrative of America's back. And he could even, just like with Roosevelt, they could look at employing all these soldiers as a jobs program. Hey, you don't have a job? Go join the military and go kill some Muslims or some brown Catholics down in South America. So in other words, I don't think that we're going to wake up to war tomorrow. I think that the overall narrative of current events needs to shift in a positive direction before the war can be sold. So if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.